Okay, hello, hi. So this is discussion time for the persistence session. I'm Amandine Gamble. I'm currently a research fellow at University of Glasgow, and I'm moving to Cornell University as an assistant professor next year. And I work, generally speaking, on pathogen dynamic in multi-host systems from an ecological perspective. And so we decided to all mention one of the big questions we think is important in the field of disease persistence. So I'll start with mine. So mine is about how to account for heterogeneity in a system when you want to understand what is driving persistence. So for instance, when we have different individuals that can carry a pathogen for more or less longer, and when we have different age classes that are involved in different transmission modes and so on. So how do we measure that, and how do we account for that when we model infectious disease dynamic?
I'm Cliff McKee. I'm a research associate at Johns Hopkins University, and I study the ecology of virus spillover in Bangladesh from bats to humans, particularly Nipah virus. And I wanted to kind of take this opportunity to ask more of a meta question to the field, since this is supposed to be sort of a retrospective on 20 years of EEID. And I was just kind of wondering about, are there sort of zombie ideas in disease ecology that just won't die, and do we just need to bury them? The example that I was thinking of is like herd immunity that might not have like the nuance that we want, and has sort of percolated into the public debate, and has been sort of used as a tool of public policy, but maybe shouldn't. So are there other ideas in disease persistence or just disease ecology in general that we need to talk about more in our lectures or just in our communications with the media, so we don't allow those old ideas to sort of persist?
Okay, my name is Kennedy Ushasi. I'm currently a PhD student studying at the Nelson Mandela African Institution of Science and Technology. And I'm supervised by Kate Hampson from the University of Glasgow. But also I work with the Fakala Health Institute as a research scientist. My work is based on rabies, and what we do in Tanzania, we are trying to eliminate rabies through mass dog vaccination, but also we are designing effective surveillance approaches which are capable of guiding rabies elimination. So my question and what I wanted to discuss at the group is that most affected societies, if you just look at the global burden of infectious diseases, it's mostly in Africa or the global south. And these infectious diseases, they are killing a lot of people. Also the governments, they are spending a lot of money in protecting their societies. But also if you look at the economic implications of the farmers or the community members, they are losing livestock also. I'm thinking of what can we do using the sciences which we are doing, because I see that we are doing a lot of good sciences. So how can we translate the science we are doing to solve the problem in areas most affected by these infectious diseases? Because my biggest concern is that we are more likely to meet in the next 20 years or so to discuss the same challenges of persistence if we don't do something now. Thank you.
Hi, though that's an excellent question. I also agree with that. And one of the troubles of our group was to decide. We have a whole list I have here of questions we wanted to ask you. I'm Catherine Herzog. I'm currently a data scientist at the new CDC Center for Forecasting and Outbreak Analytics, but was most recently a postdoc in the Webb Lab and the Bjornstad Lab here at Penn State. And I studied multi-host systems, including PPRV, and I think a lot about livestock systems. And in that system, one question I thought about a lot for persistence was the issues of cross-reactivity. So in a lot of our systems, we might look at one host, one infection, or perhaps just a few. We don't get too large. But in that system, the morbillivirus system, there's a lot of cross-immunity and cross-reactivity. So when we try to tackle the next 20 years of persistence, how do we need to frame our questions? What things do we need to ask? And how can we do this in the context of the whole environment and ecosystem in which these infections are occurring? So how do we handle cross-reactivity, co-infection, et cetera? And we're going to open up the floor to you all. You don't have to address the questions we asked, but you're welcome to, and we welcome your questions.
Yeah, thank you. wanted to speak to Kennedy's question. So we all know Africa suffers the greatest burden of infectious diseases. And currently there is a ton of empirical data being generated from Africa, right? And so there's the need to, I think, train theoretical scientists as well. That way we can, these empirical data that we generate, we could fit this to models and be able to predict transmission accurately, and then be able to identify the most important players in the transmission of a particular infectious disease. And so, yeah, basically, we need to have a good blend of empirical and theoretical scientists, and this can be achieved by capacity building. And so I think that we will be able to address what Kennedy asked.
I'm just going to echo the same point since we're here, and this is the point that we're on, right? And we're not talking about biological mechanisms of disease persistence. We've targeted in on structural and community causes of disease persistence, and I think one of those causes is clearly the knowledge that we have here and that we think is fantastic. And we're very proud of. I'm not sure that we've done a good enough job of translating that to the rest of the world and translating that to application. And I think I want to give a shout out to the graduate students and postdocs that came for the science communication workshop for several days before this. I think there was enormous amount of energy and excitement in that group about communicating their science to a wide variety of audiences. So I am enormously optimistic that this idea that has been raised can be achieved. But I also, want to look to the funders in the room as well, right? To say that, I mean, this is a structural issue, and it does absolutely need to be supported. I'll use this as a time to point out one of the structural issues that we ran into in even organizing this meeting was we had a number of colleagues and scientists that wanted to come from around the world. Sam even ran into this in his own meeting, right? That has struggled with getting visas to be able to come and be a part of this community and be a part of these activities. That was, we had the best of intentions in bringing them in, but it was a structural issue a federal scale issue that prevented us from being able to bring them in. So I do think that to achieve this, this is something active that we can do, right? Simply by spreading knowledge and expanding knowledge, we can use existing knowledge to address the persistence of many disease problems. But we really do need to be, as a community, active about tackling those structural issues.
Yeah, and just let me say, we're actually very aware of this. I'm not going to talk about the State Department and visas, but when it comes to capacity building, I'll speak for my colleagues at the Fogarty International Center at NIH. That is one of their missions, and Fogarty is one of the partners in EID. And so if you are if your research is in a low middle income country and you apply to EID, you should have a very strong capacity building component to that project, and that would make it much more likely that you will get funded. So this is actually something we actively want you to do this. So please do it.
Thank you very much for pointing out the resources that people from low and middle income countries can take advantage of. For somebody coming from a low income country, one of the things that I've realized is availability of data sets from this part of the world. My lab worked with large scale data sets looking at global and regional distribution of disease dynamics, and it's very difficult to find a very fine coverage of data that covers for Africa. So most of them, you just have to do estimations and correct for some data bias, which I think that if we increase collaboration with most of the scientists in some of these countries, it would help us to get the data that we need to make the to do more better forecasting and modeling, to be able to make policies that the people there can relate to. Because if we just estimate and we make assumptions, we can come up with great findings, but it might not be a good reflection of what's happening in the field, and the people might not be able to relate with the wonderful recommendations that we will make for them. So I recommend very broad and good collaborations with researchers out there, so we can all improve science. Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to respond. This is my first time at EEID. I'm also an international student, and I'm in the US at the moment, and so it's been easy relatively to come here. I'm curious how often EEID is held outside of the United States and how often it's held in Global South countries. You're thinking about, visa access for people coming here, travel for people coming here. How about moving the conference to a location where there's more accessibility in that sense? And maybe this has already happened, but I'm curious about how often, that's been an option, and if that's on the minds of organizers.
So we've held it. Is that on? Yeah, we've held it twice outside of the United States, but at the moment, in the future ones, we haven't had anybody come forward and suggest that we, with another proposal to hold it outside the USA. We've talked about trying to hold it in Tanzania, but at the moment, we don't have a proposal.
Yeah, so it's an important organizational thing is that the organization, the funding, the fundraising, et cetera, for this meeting, because of its scale and because of its history, has fallen on whoever the host institution is. So there's not a field-wide organization that supports this. So Penn State raised its money for this. Last year was where? Emory did it last year, et cetera. So your point is exactly right, but it requires a systemic change in how we do things, right? Because to host this meeting in a place that doesn't have the resources, we have to find a way to get resources to them in order to do that. And so far we haven't come up with a mechanism for doing that, but it's something that we should be thinking about for the next 20 years, which is the goal of some of this discussion. Absolutely.
So I wanted to comment on implementation. We've in the past and in the future. So we see a lot of ideas at EID, and I think a lot of us have this impatience of rolling out implementations that will make people's lives better, right? How do we relate this to public policy? How to relate this to NGOs, government funding? And so one observation that I have on EEID as sort of providing something like startup culture to allow a rapid exploration of a lot of different ideas. And one thing that I see as really potentially been powerful is the role that this diversity of ideas plays in potentially looking at unexpected consequences of widespread rollout of policy. And so I think one observation is that when you have something like the Gates Foundation or Gavi, when you have multi-country policies being rolled out, those generate momentum of their own and can be difficult to change mid-course. And so I think it can be very valuable to think about. So we've seen, I spent some time working on Aedes aegypti, one big question is life history of the organism. So working with domain specialists in asking some specific questions of, if we were to do this sort of spraying. So bed nets are a great example. They've been very successful, but thinking beforehand and working with funders of what could go wrong. How can we use our models to look at unexpected consequences? And so I think it behooves us to think about how our things can be implemented. But I do think there is really a capacity for troubleshooting in thinking of, oh, there's a proposal on the table. What could go wrong? And that's a place where models can be great to do in silico experiments, these sort of things. But then also, of course, communicating, right? Using visualization to help senators, to help people communicate in popular media about these sorts of widespread rollouts. So I do think on one hand, we have a lot of impatience and we want to see the world be better, but being cautious about widespread rollouts or helping implement them in the best way possible, because once those things get in motion, they can be difficult to change and you can have negative consequences far down the roads. Thank you.
Not to derail this conversation, but I just wanted to make a quick point on the great question about zombie ideas and pertaining to herd immunity. I speak as one of the undead here. There are thousands of examples of measles epidemics, very hard to explain them without susceptible limitation. Enteroviruses, strong evidence of herd immunity, RSV, many other things. Many things not, and you make a great point there. One of my favorites is the huge mystery of the persistence of morbilliviruses in tiny cetacean populations. There's just, it's a very unfunded field, but it's a fantastic series of questions there. But a great question about zombie ideas, and that would make a great idea for a session in a future EID.
Hi, thank you. I also really appreciate all this other discussion we've had about possible locations of EID and possible ways to use it to build capacity. Also wanted to steer the conversation in a slightly different way, which is all the fantastic talks this morning. I think one of the key unifying themes about persistence is that it's really a question about maintenance of diversity, where it's no longer about what's the most competitive strain in a high transmission environment, but what are the ways that diversity and variation within pathogen and host populations help to maintain persistence of disease. So I think it's sort of a plug for disease ecologists to be thinking more about community ecology theory and how we can incorporate that into our thinking of disease dynamics.
Me now? Okay, yes. I'll try to tie together a few things that I think are important to recognize that they're related. So I'll try to go in reverse order. I like that. So that, I guess, like diversity that I guess that you were speaking of, in my mind, I guess the connection that I want to make is to Amandine Gamble's also point on thinking about heterogeneity in that was your right, and then how that relates to I guess the kinds of environments that we're defining our research in, which was a bit of Kennedy's point, like where is it that we're thinking about research? How are we relating to environments beyond I guess like Pennsylvania and into the global south as well? Because I think a lot of this boils down to, if we want to think into a lot of the transmission environments that I think like Kennedy was alluding to, that some of the other comments were alluding to as well, it like the challenge is we need to account for heterogeneity in these environments. Transmission contexts are different in different parts of the world for all these kinds of reasons. And that those differences I think are, or like these kinds of ecological differences are driving a lot of the genetic differences that your comment was building to as well. So I guess like intellectually speaking, my point is we need to account for those heterogeneous environments, to account for that diversity, to account for the evolution that we're interested in. And that's happening in, the most interesting stuff is happening in these kinds of environments that Kennedy's invitation was going to. So we should do it because that's where the interesting stuff is happening. And the second thing that I wanted to point out was on, I believe your name is Sam Schneider. Yes, on how your comment on capacity building from the grant perspective. It's really cool that this is happening now, and it didn't happen in the past in the way these grants are going out, right? So I think that's excellent. I grew up and trained and did my undergrad in Colombia, and I've been on the capacity building side of a few of these projects, and I'm very grateful for them. But at the same time, I want to point out that capacity building kind of like assumes there are no capacities there, and there really are so much. So right now, for example, some of the projects that I'm tangentially involved in, there's this massive project for malaria monitoring along the lines of Angela Early's work, which we saw that just got its grant cut. And there are trained microscopists that were providing these excellent services in the field right now that are out of jobs. So the capacity is there. The challenge is we need the funding. So I encourage, I guess, from the funding perspective, to not only encourage building capacities, but like building off of existing capacities, which are often significant as well.
Great. I wanted to hop in. Thank you for those questions. I'm going to have 2 points. One on the scientific questions. We all debated this together, and we did come to a more general question that we might wish to discuss here. And given our time, it might have to take off into the distance. But we wanted to know really what is our definition of persistence. We have seen it within host. We have seen it between host. We've had environment presented to us today. And could we and should we develop a general conceptual persistence framework to guide our research over the next 20 years? How do we embrace the variance that Pete said? And my second point would be, when we're thinking about making this framework and the studies that need to, tackle different pieces of it, how can we add some of these concerns that have been brought up today into those frameworks? And I wanted to suggest 2 actions. So in the work that I've done, and I worked at a lot of the same institutions as Kennedy, we were able to return to communities, which we interacted with, and share information. That was a built-in part and funded. And then I also, myself and others, have benefited. My training program through Penn State was a majority female cohort, and at least equally balanced, if not slightly more, for African scientists from several different countries. And it was a training program. So there are already examples out there of how to incorporate this in, whether it's a whole training grant or on how to add on some of these pieces. And perhaps that's something that we can all figure out, how to add that additional piece to the work that we are all interested in. So both the scientific or the other questions, I welcome more discussion.
Excellent. So in the interest of time, I think what we've done here is we've seeded some excellent questions that we need to think about for the next 20 years. Not think about them for the 20 years, but these are the questions that are going to structure how our science develops over the next 20 years. So I want to thank you guys for your time, and stay in your seats. Clap, but stay in your seats.